The Lightning Network is the premier layer 2 scaling solution for Bitcoin, allowing people to make faster, much less expensive payments, and basically allow the whole network to grow beyond its current capacity. Now, critics say it'll end up centralized and custodial, kind of like bank accounts. But what if the real challenge is, ironically, it'll turn out to be expensive? Before we get started, I have to explain how Lightning actually works. Now, there's so many videos out there that explain this in varying degrees of detail, but I'll kind of give you the quick rundown just so you sort of understand how it works in just a couple minutes. And then you can kind of start to see what is it good at, what is it maybe not so good at, and can kind of start to concoct in your head predictions as to how it's going to evolve moving forward. So the Bitcoin Lightning Network is a web of two-way payment channels. Let's think about that a little more. It's a web of two-way, not a bunch of ways, two-way payment channels that are all connected to each other. Now, a two-way payment channel just means you and I, let's say, have a pot of money together, and we use an accounting method outside of just paying each other to determine who has how much of the pot. And so this is kind of useful for batching a payment, where instead of I have to pay a million different times, I can make all those payments kind of more efficient by batching them into one eventual settlement. So imagine I'm going to pay you a few different times. I could take the money I have, right? Make change for the exact amount that I need to pay you, and then pay you. And then figure out how to make change, and then pay you again, and again, and again, until we're done with business. Sometimes that can get inefficient. So instead of that, how about I take all this, $7, right, and put it into a pot between us, and then on a different thing, like let's just say I write down, I send you a few dollars. I send you again. I send you again, and update the balances between us until at some point we settle, we close the channel, as it's called. We settle and say you got a total of 5 out of my $7 at the end of the day, accounting for all those different transactions together. Then I get 2 back, you get 5, and we're done. So batching things that way can make things more efficient if you're going to do a bunch of back and forth payments, and you want each payment to be recorded in real time and credited in real time, but you don't have to finally settle until the end. But that's not the Lightning Network. That's just a two-way payment channel. What Lightning is a series of two-way payment channels. So I got my little channel going on with you, but then you got one with someone else, et cetera, et cetera. And if I want to pay someone who's not just you, I don't have a direct channel with, it goes person to person along that network until it kind of reaches that final destination. So again, two-way payment channels, but they're connected to each other and form a big web, and the money can travel around through the web. And by using that second layer rather than just the main chain, it becomes more efficient in some ways. You get to save the main network from having to deal with all these little transactions. You can make these smaller payments way easier. Here's how the structure of payment routing on Lightning works. If you open a channel with someone, that's easy. You just scoot some money over to their side of the channel. If you have to route, then you basically decide how much money you and the final recipient will have. Then everyone along the path scoots some money to the next person until everything works out. If someone on the path doesn't have enough money, then the payment fails to route, and either they have to fix that by putting more money in the channel, or you have to just open a channel directly with that person yourself. Now, this is very different from the way regular blockchains work, and it's important to kind of note that it's not just, well, you have the base layer of Bitcoin, and then you have a very similar but maybe faster but less secure layer on top, and it settles. It's like, no, it's a very different kind of topology entirely. Regular blockchains, like Bitcoin's main chain, scale globally, meaning everyone sees every single transaction, everyone on the network, and it all goes into one globally viewable ledger, although the amounts you're sending don't really matter, it's per transaction. Whereas the Lightning Network scales locally, meaning only the people involved in the payment and the payment route really need to know about where the money is going, need to know anything about the transactions, but it scales with liquidity, meaning there has to be money along that path And if the money doesn't scale, then that part of the network doesn't scale. In regular blockchains, everyone sends their payments to the whole network, which then puts it in a single chain of transactions. That's the scaling bottleneck, but the amount you send or who you send it to doesn't matter. With Lightning, payments only go through the nodes that need to route them, so there aren't these global scaling limitations. But you need liquidity every step of the way, and you can easily run out of money on a particular path. Your ability to pay someone wildly depends on who and how much. Okay, now time to address some criticisms of the Lightning Network. Now, I approach this thing not as a pro or anti-Lightning person. I'm trying to be as in good faith as possible. I have run a node in the past. I've studied Lightning pretty intensely, and I do still use it on a semi-regular basis. So I'm not a hater, and I'm not a fan either. I try my best to be more a relatively neutral observer. But anyway, here we go. One of the big criticisms is that it'll end up as a custodial solution, meaning that big entities will control it and be able to seize anyone's funds at a moment's notice. Is it custodial? Well, no. You can run your own node, obviously, and a lot of the lighter solutions that are kind of much easier to use and do kind of rely on larger institutions to do a lot of things, they still can't actually steal your money. Modern Lightning wallets are non-custodial, and you can back up everything. The main wallet, the main 12, 24 word phrase or whatever, and the channel states and everything. You can kind of back up the whole thing so that even if you use one of the big providers and they decide to go evil on you, they can't really steal your money. So that's not really a good criticism. Another criticism is that it's complicated and convoluted. And yeah, kind of. There is some truth to this. But for the average user today, I mean, it's not like the early days when you had to sort of run your own node and navigate this whole mess of channels. A lot of these light wallet solutions, like I mentioned, like, Phoenix and Breeze and other popular wallets, they do everything for you, basically. They figure out routes, they manage liquidity, they do all this kind of stuff, whilst, again, as I mentioned previously, still letting you control your keys and control your money. So for the end user, it's not really that complicated. You do still sometimes fail to route a payment, and that gets a little annoying. But there's other tools you can use to get around that. So it's more complicated for sure, even in the simplest way you can use it than regular crypto, but it's not that bad. And finally, people criticize it as centralized. And I think this is kind of probably one of the better critiques, because while you can run Lightning and participate in a completely decentralized way, or largely decentralized way, the way the network scales, the way you can use it more efficiently heavily favors kind of centralized solutions, especially with the more complex operations. It kind of, right now at least, the way the technology stands, favors a fewer larger parties that are more invested in technology and things like that. And so compared to just regular wallet providers and nodes across, layer one networks, I kind of feel like Lightning does tend to have fewer large hubs that, kind of form around that. So that criticism is more valid. It's not a protocol level requirement, but it does tend to kind of move in that direction. Not too long ago, in an interview I did with him, Sergey Kotlyar of Bitrefill, which is one of the larger players in the Lightning Network world, kind of admitted that while there's been a lot of great adoption gains, a lot of those have gone in a more centralized direction, and it's probably time to start exploring more decentralized ways of, diversifying the ecosystem. Largely, the more decentralized the Lightning Network is, the higher the probability of failed payments. The more possible routes you may have to use, and the more the total capital in the network is divided across those many channels, the higher the probability that any given payment will fail. On the other hand, if you concentrate the same capital into fewer nodes and channels, the chance of your payment succeeding goes up. You just don't want to centralize too much, or you defeat the entire purpose of using decentralized crypto. Okay, now that we've been over all that, the central thesis of this video, Lightning's scaling roadblock is capital. Because its structure is very different from other blockchains, this is a uniquely Lightning problem. If I want to send or receive money to anyone in the world, I only need to have whatever money I want on hand in order to send it. And I don't need any to be able to receive any at any time. And if someone wants to run wallet infrastructure to help me kind of do this, other than whatever capital they need to build, the solution, they don't actually need any capital. They just process transactions, right? This is very different for Lightning. For Lightning, someone needs to point money at me in order for me to be able to receive any. And if I want to send money to someone else has to have money along the route, enough for all the volume that gets kind of routed through them. In layer 1 networks, there isn't this concept of capacity. It's just money. If you have it, you send it, and that's it. Whereas with Lightning, the entire system and the ability to move money around has to do with the actual capacity of those channels and who has money pointing at whom in which way. And the big drawback of this is, of course, money costs money, right? You need to have money in order to send it around or receive it or do whatever. And if you want to process transactions, you need to have that liquidity on hand as well. If you want to route as like a routing node, for example, and that gets really expensive. It's not something you can kind of solve by like optimizing software and hardware and batch processing bunches. And like, no, you have to have a certain amount of Bitcoin denominated liquidity in order to make everything work. And that can start to really increase the costs of just about everything. There's a huge opportunity cost. Even if you already have the money, you could be doing other things with it. So let's just imagine that Twitter for a second decided to onboard its entire user base to the Lightning Network and allow them to receive money. Of course, with like hundreds of millions of users, this would either take hundreds of millions of Bitcoin transactions, which would be years worth of capacity, or, they could use some sort of a batch processing workaround like channel factories or something. More on that later. But what they can't get around is in order to enable every single user to receive $10, they have to put $10 in liquidity towards that user. So what's 10 times 200 million? We're talking about billions of dollars just in Bitcoin, just to enable every Twitter user to receive $10. And of course, if they need to receive more, if they send more out after they receive it, it's like $10 at a time. Obviously, that kind of shifts around a little bit, but that's like the bare minimum. So someone's got to pay that. And so unless you have users sign up for Lightning by just putting money in, like, okay, in order to send, you have to like pay Twitter $10 and then you have $10 and then you can send it around. That's the only way you could do it without charging Twitter a giant amount of money to just have a big pot of Bitcoin parked there so they can just provide liquidity to everyone. Now, before you think that there's just Bitcoin lying around and big companies or users or whatever have just money doing nothing that they can just say, oh, why don't you use it for Lightning liquidity? Remember that capital is competing with a lot of other different sources for a return on that investment. It's not just labor that is valuable. Capital is value. Having money, able to do things with it, you can earn a yield on that capital. And Lightning competes with every single one of these uses. People could be making 5% parking their Bitcoin over here. They will be doing that unless they can do it in Lightning and charge enough in fees. This is where it gets expensive. Charge enough in routing fees to then make up for what they could have been earning elsewhere. Of course, some people will do things idealistically, but at the end of the day, money talks, bullshit walks. And we're going to see a lot of things shake out very differently than maybe was marketed to us in the beginning. There's a few ways of calculating the capital opportunity cost of processing Lightning transactions. The easiest is finding the simplest way to earn yield on Bitcoin and checking the yearly return. On Thorchain, you can get about 3% right now. Then you need to factor in the costs of operating an always-on node. Hardware, bandwidth, electricity, on-chain fees for rebalancing transactions, and add those into how much you need to make. Pretty quickly, the per transaction routing fee you need to charge starts to add up. And once more, remember that this is a structural problem. This isn't some like, well, we haven't figured out how to propagate the blocks well enough. We need to remove latency and let's update the Bloom filter so we only need this much info and all this kind of stuff and bandwidth this. It's not a technical problem. You can just kind of just like work around and improve over time. I mean, some aspects of Lightning are, as we'll go into later, but this is a structural problem. Lightning works this way. It needs the capital allocated along the paths that it will move. And it becomes really difficult to make sure that there's enough capital so everyone can receive money. And that capital always has this opportunity cost. And I'm sure the capital costs will go down as people find more and more creative ways of having less capital parked behind the entire network by shifting the capital here and then there and then there. But each shift, of course, involves on-chain transactions, which then becomes expensive in a different way and makes the scaling element kind of not as attractive. So yes, whatever you're paying in Bitcoin transactions on-chain, you might start to need to pay that for Lightning transactions someday. So if Lightning is expensive, then what is it actually good at? What's it for? Well, with on-chain transactions, you have the incentive to send as few transactions with as much money as possible in each of them to be worth it. That's why people were paying those insane Ethereum fees back when they were like hundreds of dollars per transaction. It's because they were sending large enough amounts and making enough money on those transactions to make it worth it. Now, Lightning is the opposite. Anywhere you need to, for some reason, send a bunch of payments, but the volume in terms of capital going across that is not that high. That's something where it makes a lot of sense. So for example, if you do like a pay-as-you-go thing where you pay for each little item, but you're sure you're going to spend at least a certain amount at one spot, like a bar tab, right? You put like $100 onto the tab because that's as much as you're going to be spending that night. You're cutting yourself off after 100. And then each drink, each little, even if it's a shot or a sip or whatever, you zip a little bit of Lightning across. And then at the end of the day, you're like, oh, I only spent 67, settle, and then you get the rest back, right? Something like that. Closed loop ecosystems are kind of good too, where let's just say you have a farmer's market or something, and everyone is participating on that one day, and they all open up channels, and then everyone sends payments around here and there, and everyone kind of gets paid, and then they kind of close out at the end of it. Something where it's like, you can only send money within this small ecosystem, but it kind of makes sense because of a frequency of payment. And you can just batch those into just a few big on-chain transactions, and the Lightning ones just kind of save on that. Another one is big exchanges or financial institutions, because you can have a network between a few of these big ones and move liquidity back and forth between those. Like, for example, let's say if I'm a Coinbase customer and I want to pay my buddy who's a Kraken customer, all they have to do is just move that little bit of money, relatively speaking, across their channel and just account for it on the other end. And just if people are paying each other all the time, very, very frequently, you have money going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth across that channel, or maybe the one to Gemini or something as well. And it just works out because it's just one channel between each of these things with high volumes of payment. And if they start to run low on one side of the liquidity, then because it's a big institution, they have so much capital just lying around anyway, they can just rebalance a transaction and then it all works out. It's a lot better than just individuals running around kind of doing small transactions. But where it doesn't really make sense, ironically enough, is for the digital cash use case, where you are sending to a bunch of different people on individual bases, because you're still going to be doing a lot of on-chain transactions, and the individual, if you're paying like, let's just say in the future, $50 for an on-chain transaction, in order to just open a channel, that's gotta hurt. And you'll probably have to redo or rebalance channels along the way. And it just complicated and expensive and all that. It's much easier for someone to just do big kind of batch liquidity things and send small amounts through small ecosystems, closed ecosystems, rather than just you on your own sending Lightning to this person, that person, that person, that person. And people are doing that right now because they're, interested in the tech. They're believers and they're having fun and all that. And more importantly, people aren't really trying to make money yet. They're still bootstrapping the ecosystem. At some point when people are routing payments, they're doing it for free or because it's fun or whatever. They're going to have to start charging something. And when they start charging something, then it becomes more expensive. Doesn't really work nearly as well as digital cash. But those aforementioned use cases, I think it could work pretty well for that. And in so doing, take a lot of transaction volume off the main chain, so it's easier to use peer-to-peer payments on layer 1. Okay, so if that's the state of Lightning today, can you fix it? Is there anything you can do to make it kind of work out better? Well, maybe. I mean, the liquidity issue is structural. The way Lightning works, unless you change it in some way to where instead of opening up two-way channels, you just bridge Bitcoin from Bitcoin to Lightning, and it's just this one giant pot and everyone kind of sends to each other without having to be connected to each other, then it would be different. But that's a completely different situation. You have to do a lot of changes onto the main Bitcoin chain in order to enable that. But you can do some things to make it more efficient. There's a bunch of on-chain fixes that make Lightning a little bit less clunky to use. Like, for example, channel factories, where a bunch of people can all join into one on-chain transaction that just rebalances everyone's funds, everyone's channels. So like, if I don't have enough channel with you, you don't have whatever, you have a liquidity problem, everyone joins together and just ups their liquidity or shuffles it around in one big move. And of course, that's a lot better for large, more technically competent institutions than it is for every single individual, but it's still something that could reduce the amount significantly of on-chain transactions that go into this. There's also loop in, loop out, splicing, submarine swaps, and a bunch of other things where basically you send an on-chain transaction and it instantly turns into Lightning on the other end, or vice versa. But basically cutting in and out without having to close a channel and reopen the channel and rebalance, make sure, just saving a bunch of steps, but basically allowing you to just sort of kind of airdrop in some real Bitcoin here or just cut it out real quick and make everything go smooth, right? In fact, on-chain fixes to Lightning can improve the user experience so much that one of the most popular Lightning wallets was busted for doing submarine swaps almost exclusively, doing on-chain to Lightning for all but the very smallest of transactions. Another thing you could do is have bigger blocks. Big controversy, I know, but if you had more on-chain Bitcoin capacity, now you don't have to be a giant blockchain, but if you increase some capacity, then it's, say you have Bitcoin transactions are always around 50 cents, right? A little more expensive than like a 1 cent or less for like mass on-chain scaling chains. Then if you have to send an on-chain transaction for every like 3 to 5 Lightning transactions or something, you're still cutting down on the traffic on the main chain, but you just do need some more capacity in order to allow people to transact a little bit more freely, especially on that peer-to-peer kind of level I said that Lightning wasn't necessarily good at. If you have enough on-chain transaction capacity though, and you can afford to just use 1/5 or something, or 1/10 the number of on-chain payments, but you still make a lot of on-chain payments, then the peer-to-peer use case can kind of work a little bit better if you have the right wallets and such. And of course, it would really help to have more secure zero confirmation transactions, meaning when you send a payment, you don't have to wait for it to be in a block before being moderately sure that it's going to be completed. Of course, ironically enough, replace by fee is starting to become mandatory, which means that zero confirmation transactions are becoming less secure. So I don't know how much hope I should hold out for that. Now I know what you're thinking here. Why not just become a layer 1 scaling chain? Why not just increase the block size, get rid of replace by fee, and work on zero confirmation security? Work on sharding of the main chain so that everyone can kind of still run their own node if they only have to process one piece of the blockchain at a time, and it kind of works out that way. Why not just go that way? Or why not use a different cryptocurrency that's already doing things like this? Good question. And that is a question for another video, I think. So yes, Lightning is still probably your best bet at using Bitcoin as your everyday money today. And it'll keep getting better as people improve the protocol over time and wallets and everything else. But just be prepared that it might get a lot more expensive to use in the future. Get ready.